From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. New York City is the home of global finance, the headquarters of the national media, and the wealthiest city in the world. It's kind of like the Capitol in the Hunger Games. It rules over us all, which means its upcoming mayoral election is a national event, and that election could reverberate throughout American politics. Today on Lever Time, I talked to the upstart candidate whose entire campaign is focused on challenging oligarchy and corporate power, and who polls now show has a chance to win a stunning upset victory that could radically alter the direction of the entire Democratic Party.
This is a campaign that is going to win on June 24th.
I also checked in with one of New York's recent mayors, who himself faced the full wrath of the city's oligarchy when he dared to challenge them. Bill Delasio tells me what he thinks Democrats can learn from his experience, and why, even if you don't live in New York, you should absolutely care what happens in this crazy election.
What am I supposed to do? Go on television and tell 10 million people they have to be nice to each other?
When I was growing up, I thought New York mayors were basically all this guy, the mean, cranky mayor of New York from the film Ghostbusters.
Being miserable and treating other people like dirt is every New Yorker's God-given right.
That's the kind of attitude that seemed to be once again on offer in this year's mayoral election in the Big Apple. It looked like it was just going to be a quiet coronation for disgraced former governor Andrew Cuomo, the Trump-like, scandal-plagued comic book supervillain who had recently resigned after a nursing home cover-up and a sexual harassment controversy, but who had come back to run for mayor. Lining up behind Cuomo in the Democratic primary was not only the city's oligarchy and their super PACs, but many of the Democratic politicians who once demanded his resignation. The fix seemed to be in. It seemed the election would just be the same old corrupt Democratic Party doing the same old thing. But then, as if out of nowhere, came this guy.
To Mr. Cuomo, I have never had to resign in disgrace. I have never cut Medicaid. I have never stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from the MTA. I have never hounded the 13 women who credibly accused me of sexual harassment. I have never sued for their gynecological records, and I have never done those things because I am not you, Mr. Cuomo. And furthermore, the name is Mandani, M-A-M-D-A-N-I. You should learn how to say it because we got to get it right.
When I saw that clip of Democratic Assemblyman Zoran Mandani taking on Cuomo in the mayoral debate, I was blown away. Here's a guy running an underdog campaign for the Democratic nomination for mayor, and he's pulling no punches. He's running explicitly against not only Cuomo's corruption, but against the entire billionaire class. What makes this race such a potential game changer for the Democratic Party is the fact that Mandani is running in the wealthiest, most unequal city in America. New York is a city that has more millionaires than mid-sized cities like Cleveland or Orlando have total people. It's also one of the most flagrantly corrupt political systems in the entire country, and has been for decades. This is the home of Tammany Hall, and now its current mayor, Eric Adams, who's been plagued by scandals since day one. New York's motto is, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Well, the same holds true for politics. If a populist anti-corruption candidate like Zoran Mandani could win there, campaigning for higher taxes on millionaires, free city buses, a rent freeze, and lower grocery prices, then maybe one could win anywhere. New York is also a city where 1 out of every 24 residents is a millionaire. This is almost medieval. It's like a feudal level of wealth inequality. And oligarchs want to preserve it rather than fix it. They're dumping $24 million into super PACs trying to defeat Zoran Mandani. Why? Because he dared to propose that the millionaires pay slightly higher taxes to make sure poor people have access to some free buses. That, my friends, is the class war and the democracy crisis all rolled up into one mayoral election. Of course, the encouraging news is that this race appears to be competitive despite all that spending. And it's competitive because of the city's system of public financing of elections, and because while Cuomo seems to be in hiding, Mandani has been everywhere. Luckily, I managed to get a quick call from him between campaign stops. So in this first part of today's Lever Time episode, you're going to hear our discussion about what the stakes are in this race and how he would run City Hall, knowing that the collective power of oligarchs would be trying to stop him at all costs. But first, we started our discussion with a really straightforward question. I asked him why he thinks all the money and power in New York is so unified against him.
Because we represent a challenge to politics as it's been in this city and in this state and even in this country. We are running on a very clear message of making the most expensive city in the United States affordable. And there are a lot of people who've made a lot of money on the lack of that affordability. And it's one of the chief reasons why we're seeing so many Trump donors, billionaires, pouring in millions of dollars to support Andrew Cuomo's super PAC, because they know that this is going to be the exact thing they fear most, a Muslim immigrant progressive who actually fights for the things that I believe in.
Why do you think a solid number of voters say they are supporting Andrew Cuomo? And obviously you're very competitive in the polls. But I mean, here's a guy, and I've done a lot of reporting on him, who's covered up nursing home deaths, was credibly accused of sexual harassment, plagued by serious corruption scandals, and yet he's still a competitive candidate. What are we to make of that? Like, how do we explain that?
I think a lot of that support is still name recognition. It is reflective of the fact that he is unique in that every single New Yorker knows his name. And in spite of being a former governor who's the son of a former governor, he still can't secure a majority of New Yorkers' support in the first round of voting. No matter who is going to win this race, and we are confident it's going to be us, everyone will need ranked choice voting to get across that finish line. And what I've actually found in my conversations with New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs is a lot of his support isn't actually for him. It's a support that is a relic of support for his father. I've had pastors tell me, I'm supporting Mario's son. And I think it is indicative of a campaign whose coalition is a mile wide but an inch deep, that is premised in many ways on a sense of inevitability. And yet we know it's a house of cards, that as soon as you start to shake it, the whole thing could topple. And that's what we're seeing, is that we took what was at one point 3 months ago a 40-point lead he had in the final round, and we have now cut that down to single digits. And that's even though there is close to $20 million being spent against us by Andrew Cuomo's super PAC.
How important has public financing been in your race? I mean, it seems to me that Andrew Cuomo would have been able, and his donors would have been able to buy this race without you having access to public campaign financing. I'm just curious your take on how pivotal that is for you, for candidates like you, to run in a race like this.
It's incredibly important because what it allows is the amplification of the voice of ordinary New Yorkers as opposed to the billionaires who have grown used to buying our elections. We raised the maximum amount of money we could spend in this race, which is $8 million, by raising an average of about $80 from more than 20,000 people. And we saw that our number one profession of our donors was teachers. This is a campaign powered by the very New Yorkers who've been left behind by the politics of Andrew Cuomo and the politics of the past. However, in creating this public matching fund system, I do not think there was enough recognition of the possibility of how super PACs could make a mockery of it. Because while it has equalized the playing field to a greater extent than before, we are still speaking about having $8 million going up against effectively $30 million, and a distortion of our democracy funded by the very people who put Donald Trump back in the White House.
If you win, you have to work with, or maybe fight, some of the same powers that are aligned against you in this race. And And look, they've often tried to stop progressives like you in the rare occasions that people like you get elected, and they try to make an example out of people like you by putting up an obstruction. The question then is, what will you do to try to get things done when you know, looking ahead, that will be the case, that the opposition will be looking to stop you at every turn?
I will continue to understand the power of mass politics and the necessity of having a coalition that supports you both inside and outside. Because what we've seen is that we cannot simply win an election on June 24th as one candidate, one person. We have to win it with one platform where New Yorkers know exactly what they're voting for. They're voting to freeze their rent. They're voting to make the slowest buses in the country fast and free. They're voting to deliver universal child care. And when they know that, it means that we then win with a mandate to deliver those things. And we take that mandate to Albany, and we take that mandate to elected officials across the ideological spectrum. And I have experience in doing this, having won the first fare-free bus pilot in New York City history, by building alongside elected officials of a wide variety of ideology across the Democratic Party, and doing so by ensuring that we made clear that the most important part of that coalition was not me, but rather was the idea that every bus should be free, because that's an idea that every elected and every New Yorker can see themselves in.
When you look to being mayor of such a large city, when you think about the central problem preventing a more affordable city, this question of, and it's a question for the Democratic Party too, is it oligarchs and corporations and their greed? Is it, as some in the so-called abundance movement argue, is it that there are too many liberal or progressive regulations, making it too hard to build or get anything done? Like, what is in your power analysis, the central driver of scarcity, or the central obstacle to building and delivering prosperity?
I think it's a synthesis of both of these issues. And I would say that these regulations in and of themselves, I wouldn't call them progressive or liberal regulations, but what I've found time and time again is a real level of political cowardice that is endemic in our system in New York City, where we will use processes and things which are by law advisory as justifications for not pursuing the very things that we need most. I have seen many a worthy idea die at a community board meeting that actually has no legal ability to stop that. It is simply used as a justification to not pursue that protected bike lane, that proposal to build low-income housing for seniors, so many of the very things that we are in dire need of in the city. And I think that what is exciting to me is that as a leftist, as someone who believes firmly in the importance of the public sector and public service, is the necessity of us bringing public excellence back into that we understand and acknowledge that any inefficiency within our own work will be used as a justification to remove the entire sector itself. And that is a responsibility to live up to ensure that we look at the public sector as a shining example of what could be.
At this point, I turned our conversation to one of the quirks of New York politics. In New York, the mayor gets elected with a mandate, but the governor is especially powerful and can veto a lot of what a mayor wants to do. In fact, in an interview this week, New York's Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul all but promised to veto Mandani's tax proposals if he ends up winning the mayor's race.
I'm not raising taxes on people at a time when affordability is the big issue. I'm actually cutting middle class taxes.
Even on the wealthy.
I don't want to lose any more people to go to Palm Beach.
This kind of thing happened when Bill Delasio was mayor and Governor Andrew Cuomo constantly tried to veto his agenda. So I asked Zohran Mamdani what he would do about that problem.
I've dealt with that myself already as a first-term assembly member. When I went up to Albany, I was helping lead the fight to increase taxes on billionaires and corporations, which Andrew Cuomo, who was at the time the governor, did not want to do, primarily because of the fact that they were his major donors. And we were able to overcome his objections to increase those taxes to raise $4 billion in new revenue to fully fund the public schools that he had been starving for years. And part of the way we were able to win that battle was by organizing across the legislature. And I continue to see an appetite for these forms of revenue raisers, as well as the exact things we would spend that money on between the state assembly and the state senate. And I think it's that partnership that will be key in delivering this economic agenda for New Yorkers.
If you win, what do you think Democrats across the country should take away from that win?
I would say it's premature for me to announce that with 7 days to go until the election. But I would tell you that in addition to being a city with a proud progressive history, we are also the wealthiest city in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. This is, in many ways, the heart of the battle for the future of the Democratic Party, a battle between cosmopolitan finance and the ideals that brought so many to call themselves Democrats in the first place, a commitment to the working class. And I think that there is a clear path and a clear precedent for so much of what we're trying to achieve in our own history. In Fiorello LaGuardia, who I would argue is the greatest mayor in our city's history, as someone who took on twin crises of delivering dignity to the working class New Yorkers who'd long been denied it, and fighting an anti-immigrant animus. And that's what we see in this moment, a necessity to take on authoritarianism on the outside and understand democracy not simply being under attack from Washington, but also under attack from within, where more and more New Yorkers do not see themselves in this electoral process because they don't see their needs reflected in these very campaigns. And what I'm excited about is that this is a campaign focusing on affordability and also seeking to bring in the very New Yorkers who've been left out by virtue of their class, by virtue of their religion, by virtue of their race, to ensure that this city's election looks a lot more like this city itself.
After the break, we're going to talk to the last progressive Democratic mayor of New York. I'll ask Bill de Blasio about the challenges of trying to lead a city as big, complicated, and unequal as the Big Apple. And I'll ask him about the larger civil war among Democrats over what direction the party needs to move in order to challenge Trumpism.
Loving me now, aren't you?
When I think of Bill de Blasio, I think of that line you just heard from Jerry Maguire. When de Blasio was mayor, his popularity went up and down, and by the time he left office in 2021, his poll numbers were not that great. But since then, New York City Hall has been engulfed in dysfunction and scandal, and so lots of people are loving Bill de Blasio now, retroactively realizing that maybe they had it good. I got to know Bill de Blasio during Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign, and so I called him up to get his thoughts on the current state of play in New York and what it means for the national Democratic Party.
I don't want to overstate it, but I feel like there's a recognition that we were dealing with the thing that everyone feels now. They feel affordability. They feel in this city, like it's harder and harder to live here. And that's what I was trying to act on. And I think in retrospect, I've had a lot of people come up to me and say thank you, whether it was for pre-K for all or 3K for all, both for the good of their kids, but also because it put a lot of money back in their pocket. And, childcare is astoundingly expensive around here. I have people come up to me and say thank you for rent freeze, or thank you for, affordable housing that they got into, or paid sick days, whatever it may be. So the whole idea was to fight income inequality and make life affordable for working people. And I may not have been the best vessel or communicator at all times, but I think the work is standing the test of time, and people are feeling it now, what it meant for them. And yeah, in times they're feeling the absence.
The affordability question is at the center of the New York mayor's race, and I want to get to that because I think that speaks to a concern that whether you live in New York or you live anywhere else, that is the central daily challenge across the country. For those who don't live in New York, they're probably nonetheless hearing a lot about the New York mayor's race, and I want to start with a kind of a top line question, which is why do these New York mayor's races seem to grab so much national attention beyond the fact that it's the national media capital? I do think there's something about these particular races and that particular office that is unlike any other in the country. And I'd be curious from you, somebody who was the mayor, why that is, and not only why that is, but what kinds of responsibilities it puts to a mayor in that job.
You know, back in the 1960s, in the, I guess, the era of John Lindsay, the job was called the second toughest job in America. And having done it, it may well be true. It's an extraordinarily difficult, you know, everything is controversial by its nature in New York. You know, almost 9 million people, the most diverse place on earth. I always say I represented 9 million highly opinionated people. I mean, it's just, we are passionate, you know, intense people. But beyond that, you know, I think it's the greatest city in the world by, you know, the numbers, clearly the biggest and most influential city in America. The election's an off year. That's important, you know, when we have our elections when there's not as much going on politically in the country, and then it becomes a bit of a bellwether. And then often the figures who become New York City mayor loom large in the national discussion. So I think there's a lot of factors. But what's really powerful this year is this mayor's race is picking up right where November left off. November, in retrospect, was about affordability. And I'm a Democrat, and you know I'm a progressive, and I love my party, but I have a huge critique of what happened in November. And how we went about it.
Tell us.
Well, we didn't speak to the central issue. And I think what's happening here, I mean, I'll compare sort of in reverse. Here, you have candidates laser focused on affordability. And the three, look, I'll level set right up front, David. Anybody but Cuomo. Okay, I want to be very clear about that. The one thing I say publicly that's definitive in my position is do not rank Andrew Cuomo, leave him off your ballot. There are a number of good and decent candidates. By the way, not a one of them has a scandal to their name or any corruption in the background, which is a beautiful thing. Three that are particularly prominent, no particular order, just three who are particularly prominent and accomplished and visionary, in my view: Adrian Adams, Brad Landers, Orhan Mamdani. All of them have run campaigns that are both positive and focused on affordability and speak to the lives of everyday people. Not accidentally, Orhan and Adrian come from Queens. Brad comes from Brooklyn. They're speaking to the lives of, you know, almost 7 million plus New Yorkers live in the outer boroughs. They're speaking to the lived experience of working people, which is how tough it is to make ends meet. So they're talking about childcare. Orhan's talking about free buses, which I think is right on the money. Everyone's talking about childcare. They're talking about affordable housing. Meanwhile, Cuomo wants the election to be about crime. And he wants to paint this Gotham City-like, Batman-like picture of, you know, city on the edge and about to collapse, like some movie from the 1970s. But that's not what everyday people are feeling. They're feeling affordability. Well, now let's step back to October, November 2024. I was out in Michigan. I was campaigning for Kamala Harris all over Michigan. You could, like, it was jumping off the page how much people were feeling the inflation, the impact of COVID still in their lives, in the aftermath. The fact that for 40 years, working people have been going backwards in this country, not forwards. All of that was coming to a head. And neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris spoke to that with the kind of empathy and sharpness and clear, meaningful proposals that could have put the lie to Donald Trump. Donald Trump sounded more pissed off about the status quo than our Democratic leaders did, even though Donald Trump was only going to create tax giveaways for the wealthy and corporations and make the status quo worse. He sounded pissed off, and he talked about affordability and inflation all the time. Well, I think it's something we should actually feel good about, that the leading progressive candidates in the New York City mayor's race, that's what they're focused on, affordability and what people are going through at their kitchen tables every night trying to make ends meet. And if all Democrats would do that, we would be in a hell of a lot better shape.
You mentioned Andrew Cuomo, so let's talk a little bit about him. I want to ask first about how he is even a competitive force in this race. We have done a lot of reporting on Andrew Cuomo, the nursing home situation, the immunity for nursing homes, and he got lots of money from the healthcare lobby. This is during the COVID situation. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, he has a sexual harassment scandal, all sorts of corruption scandals, some that have gone all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. He resigned in disgrace. All of a sudden, he is back, and he is polling, obviously competitively, if not the front runner, then certainly competitively. This is a guy who has more corruption and ethics scandals and problematic behavior than perhaps any politician in America, other than Donald Trump.
Correct.
And he is a competitive force in a New York City mayor's race, a city that arguably he hasn't really even lived in. I'm curious what you take from that. Like, what does that mean about Democratic politics, about American politics?
So the last piece really needs to be focused on. He hasn't lived in New York City in a real way. He just showed up, obviously, the last few months in a luxury apartment, no less, in Manhattan. But he hasn't lived in New York City for over 30 years. And he doesn't understand life in New York City. I was constantly frustrated as mayor trying to explain to him the biggest city in his own state. He thinks it's still like the 1980s or something in New York City. So that's the first problem, because that directly informs why he thinks everything should be about crime and can't really speak meaningfully to the affordability crisis because it has no personal resonance for him. In terms of the bigger point you make, there's only one parallel to Donald Trump. They are so similar, it is stunning. It's not that they're just both from Queens and came up in that same era. Both were sort of forged in the 1980s. They both practice a politics that's full of vindictiveness, bullying, trying to muscle rather than ever seeking consensus. You could say, well, oh, that's just politics, right? Or that's just leadership. The problem is with Cuomo, like with Trump, it's about their own political needs and their own ego, and that's where everything ends. There's no moral structure. I think sometimes people conflate Mario Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo in that sense. Mario Cuomo had a moral structure. Mario Cuomo was extremely courageous on issues like the death penalty. Andrew Cuomo doesn't have a moral structure. It's just about his endless quest to be president of the United States and to outdo his dad. That's what this is about. And so just like we could say with Trump, obviously whatever Trump's dad did to him and whatever happened in that relationship created a certain ego dynamic that plays out negatively for all of us every day. A lot of that is true in a different variation with Cuomo. It shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't have been possible for Donald Trump to come back from felony conviction, everything he did to women ever, January 6, 2021. He shouldn't have been able to come back from any of that. Ironically, people in the Cuomo camp will say, I've heard them say off record, they took solace, they took inspiration from Donald Trump coming back from all that. They particularly noted that Donald Trump had a horrible history of harassing women, but was able to convince people to look past it. So they reasoned that reality and what they saw as the decline of the Me Too movement and the sense that among some that movement went too far, that they could use all of that as their fulcrum for a comeback and sort of cleanse him, because no one was going to make a big enough issue of the fact that he harassed 13 different women, according to the United States Department of Justice, under Joe Biden. Let's be clear, under his own party's administration. They reasoned that people didn't want to talk about COVID anymore. So the fact that he sent seniors to their death in nursing homes, and there was an effort to cover up the truth and the numbers while trying to get a book deal to make himself famous so he could run for president. All of that, they reasoned people would look away, because they were so afraid of crime, or they wanted a experienced leader, or maybe he could convince them that the best person to take on Trump was someone like Trump. And I'll tell you, I've had people say to me about, their friends, their neighbors, like some people saying, oh, we need a tough guy to take on a tough guy, or we need a thug to take on a thug. That's the most dangerous backwards theory in the world. That's how a lot of the most evil people in history got their foot in the door. So, that explains, in my view, part of why he was able to make a play of it, that theory is what fueled them. And then tragically, in my view, all the attention on Washington, all the attention on Trump has given less opportunity for people to really examine Cuomo's record and see how bad it is. I do not feel like the media or the political class has done a good job of vetting. I think a lot of people in the political class have been cowardly, and they hear his voice again. They live in fear of him, as they always do. And he head fakes well. He's convinced everyone is inevitable, so they go running to him.
But I think you're right. It is really, really dangerous that Trump not being a cautionary tale, Trump being a guidebook, essentially, among some Democratic voters who understandably want Trumpism confronted.
Right.
But I think you're right. Like, the idea that a Trump is the best, a Trumpish character is the best way to confront Trump is extremely, extremely problematic. And I would also say this, and I want your reaction to it, which is this idea of Andrew Cuomo being a tough guy. I mean, it seems to me that Andrew Cuomo, one of the through lines through his career has been not really being much of a tough guy when it comes to the people
yes.
who have lots of power. That, like, donors, I mean, he is the beneficiary of, like, all the comic book supervillain money in this race. I think it was, the landlords, the ride share companies, et cetera, like, all the bad guys in the comic book are behind Andrew Cuomo, in my view, because they know he's a tough guy that in standing up for them. He's not a tough guy against them. And I know you ran into some clashes with him over some of those things. Like, for instance, in New York, for those who don't know, the governor has a lot of power over the city. So the mayor can want to do, X, Y, and Z, but has to go to the governor on something like a millionaire's tax and the like. I mean, talk to us about perhaps some of the clashes that you had with Andrew Cuomo, where he really wasn't a tough guy against the people who have the power.
Well, let's begin with where my kind of break with him began. He and I had for years a good relationship. I even worked for him once upon a time when he was HUD secretary in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I thought highly, he's a skilled guy, he's an intelligent guy, and when he puts his mind to something, he can get some good stuff done. That's all true. But what I found over the years was more and more of a proclivity to lie, just very comfortably lie. And exactly what you said, David, that he put his energy into backing up the status quo. He put his energy into doing the bidding of those who are already rich and powerful. And, it was thinly guised, and it wasn't even populist rhetoric. It was sort of thinly guised in the rhetoric of, doing the public's good. But in the end, the more you watched, the more it became obvious he's always been backed by huge amounts of corporate money, real estate money, the wealthy in this town. He literally, one of the first acts he did as governor, is he went after the union movement in this state, and he came up with this committee that raised $20 million, all anonymous. I think it was called the Committee to Save New York, or some wonderfully euphemistic, messed up title. And like, the first act of the drama was him shepherding the resources of the rich and powerful to affront working people. And that's been the model over and over. So when I went to him in 2014, I won that election for mayor in 2013 with 73% of the vote. In this wildly diverse place, 73% of the vote should mean something. And the number one thing I stood for was a tax on the wealthy to fund pre-K for all. So every single child, regardless of background, regardless of income, anything, would get full day quality pre-K for free. And I went to him and I said, hey, how can we make this happen? And the first conversation, he's like, we're not going to do that. That's impossible. And I said, okay, tell me why. And his reasoning was, it's a high tax state and we shouldn't do more taxes. And I said, well, I don't want to tax everyone in the state. I just want to tax New York City residents who make higher incomes, not everyone, only high incomes, millionaires and above. And it's a very small amount to pay for kids to go to pre-K, which is in everyone's interest, right? It's for the good of the city, the business community, to help get them a better workforce in the future, all these nice things. And he's like, no, there's no way. And I said, again, if all we want to do is tax our own wealthy people, you could just put it on me, blame me. He's like, nope. No new taxes on the wealthy. So I said, okay. That could be your position. My position will be the one that 73% of the people in New York City just voted for me to pursue. So let's just go and have a nice, fair fight in the legislature. You defend your position, I'll defend my position, and let's see what happens. He's like, no, you can't do that. I'm the governor. You can't do that. I'm like, of course I can do it. People voted for me to do it. So that's what happened. And he thought it was disdainful that I was defending the very platform I ran on. Well, what happened in the end, the reason we got pre-K for all in New York City, in addition to a Democratic state assembly that did stand up vibrantly for it, energetically, we had a Republican state Senate propped up by conservative Democrats, supported by Andrew Cuomo, to make sure that he always had a Republican majority in the state Senate so he would not have to act on progressive initiatives. Even those conservative Democrats started to feel the heat from the grassroots in their own districts, and they didn't want to vote against pre-K for all. And they went to Cuomo and said, you can't make us do this. And so his compromise was to find the money equivalent of what the tax would have raised, find it within the state budget and give it to us.
And
in the end.
Yeah, that's a big victory.
It's a big victory. It wasn't exactly the one I wanted, but it's still, we achieved the goal for kids, and it's been an incredible success. Couldn't be more proud of how effective pre-K for all has been. And then that sparked pre-K for all as our next move to reach 3-year-olds. But here's the point, David. He had incredible energy for defending the interests of the wealthy. And so your point before, he was tough on behalf of the wealthy and the powerful. But does he go to bat against them on behalf of working people? Is he courageous in that sense? Is he tough? Is he, the thug for the working guy? The exact opposite. He is the best friend the status quo ever had. And if you look at what he's saying now, he's trying to distract everyone away from the affordability question by telling them, we're in this horrible deathscape and only he can save us from crime and disorder. I must say, aided and abetted now by the New York Times editorial board painting the same picture and denying the extent of the affordability crisis, which is its own story, how this elitist paper could act like people in New York City are not suffering every day with prices they can't afford. I mean, it's just like a clear advertisement for the status quo trying to defend its own interest and trying to distract people from the thing they're living every moment and the fact that they need new leaders and they need new ideas. And I'm your poster child. I'm your case study here. They said, including the New York Times, pre-K for all was a pipe dream. It was impossible. It was some liberal or progressive dreamscape that would never happen, except it did happen. And these other ideas can happen if we're willing to do something different to address what's wrong in our city.
Well, and you to your point about the sort of media and political establishment, I mean, the number of Democratic politicians, as an example, who said Cuomo needs to resign, who are now, when he was governor, who now say, who endorsed him for mayor. You've got Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire behind Cuomo. You've got, as I said, the landlord lobby, the rideshare lobby, now the New York Times. I mean, it really is. It really does feel like a comic book situation where you've got like the supervillain and all the Legion of Doom behind him, and you've got these other candidates who are competitive, and so that raises a question of the other candidates that you mentioned who are campaigning in a very different way from Andrew Cuomo, on very different promises, on very different pledges. I look at this from outside, and I say, it's amazing that they're able to be competitive when the Legion of Doom is so aggressively trying to buy this race. And I one thing that I've come upon, we did this audio series called Master Plan about the legalization of corruption in America, the legalization of the buying and selling of policy, the buying and selling of elections. New York, known historically as one of the most corrupt cities and states in the country, which is really saying a lot. But it has a public financing system of elections when it comes to candidates running for office. And it seems to me, looking at this race, the fact that this race is even competitive now in the polls, with candidates campaigning in the way on the affordability issue in a way that oligarchs don't like, and the oligarchs are behind the Legion of Doom is behind Andrew Cuomo. The fact that it's competitive seems to be no matter what necessarily happens in the election, a reminder to folks who are sick and tired of corruption across the country that actually every single election doesn't have to be an uncompetitive coronation of the person with the money. That there actually is. It's not a perfect solution, but there is a way to restore a bit of democracy, even in a place that has had such rampant corruption. Do you agree with that? And do you think the public financing of candidates? I mean, it seems like a really arcane thing, but do you feel like it's a game changer here?
Oh my God, yes. So look, there's a couple of different pieces I want to pull out of what you said. First, on public financing, my administration, we sponsored a referendum to make it stronger. Now it's an 8-to-1 match. This is a model that can be applied at any locality, city, county, state, and the country. 8-to-1 match.
Explain what that means to somebody who doesn't understand it.
Any New York City resident, if they give $10 or more, up to $250, that donation is matched 8-to-1. So let's say a resident can only give $10 to a mayoral candidate. There's an $80 match that the public provides, the public treasury provides to that candidate. And the idea is that a candidate can, and we have very clear, by the way, we have very clear donation limits, we have very clear spending limits. So a candidate could run even for mayor of the biggest city in the country and never speak to a single big donor. They could just raise the money at the grassroots. A $250 donation, for example, gets a $2,000 match. So that's pushing you into big donor territory. But it starts with the average person doing something that then expands in its impact. So the notion here is when you make it accessible, and this, I would never, ever have been elected without a matching funds program. It was less generous when I ran, but still substantial. No way in hell I would have been 8 years as mayor of New York City and given us things like pre-K for all if it weren't for matching funds. So we put in this even better version in my administration, 8-to-1 match. And what happened? A city council historically had been highly disproportionate in terms of gender, male dominated. For the first time ever in the election of 2021 became majority women. Like instantaneous change in terms of actual representation, because matching funds opened up the system and allowed people to run who would have been excluded before, allowed them to be viable when they wouldn't have been before. So that's that. On the question of what progressives are showing on the ground, it's striking. Look, I was able to win in New York City. New York Times was against me. The other editorial boards were against me. The business community, the real estate community, they were all against me. The party structures, Democratic Party structures were against me. I won without a runoff. That was before ranked choice voting. I won without a runoff because I was able to speak to people about the tale of two cities, fighting inequality, affordability, et cetera, and they cared, and they made their decision. So it didn't matter that all this money and power was arrayed against me.
I would ask, how much buy-in did you have to get on any of these policies with different stakeholders who perhaps weren't with you in the election, but knew they had to work with you? I'm like, parts of the business community, parts of, any of the stakeholders that progressives are typically not branded to, if you will. How much buy-in do you have to get from them? And what are the buy-in opportunities where those sides, essentially capital and labor, can work together?
There's always the possibility to work together. I want to emphasize that. I was tough on the real estate community, for example, but a lot of folks in the real estate community, to their credit, if you drove a hard bargain with them, but you still find a way to make it viable, they would learn to live with it. We had what's called mandatory inclusionary housing. We said, constantly folks in the development world wanted to build higher, to build bigger, denser. I personally didn't have a problem with that if I got enough affordable housing in the deal. That was my bottom line. I wanted affordable housing for working people. We could come to an understanding and get that done. So there's plenty of examples like that I think it's exactly the flip of the equation you were pointing out earlier with Cuomo. If the powers that be, the wealthy, the corporations, the real estate folks, all know you're in the tank for them, they're not going to demand anything.
Right.
They're going, I should say it better. They are going to, if you're not demanding of them, they are going to go on with business as usual. Okay. If they know you will challenge them and you have power to back it up and you have the people on your side, they have to deal with that. So in the end, the folks who had the wealth and power in this city, in this state, knew they could depend on Cuomo not to ruffle their feathers. But they came to understand that I would demand a lot of them, but I'd try in the end to be what I thought was fair, and we could get somewhere together. They didn't always like it, but we could get somewhere. My job wasn't to win a popularity contest with the rich and powerful. My job was to defend the interests of New York City and the people of New York City. So I think the whole point here is, if you show them that you'll be tough, and in fact, we do have power in the public sector. This is something I think is fundamentally misunderstood. Private sector in many parts of the country, maybe not all, but in many parts of the country, they cannot get done what they want to get done without having to some extent to accommodate the needs of the public sector. That you can't just build things in most parts of the country without getting permits, without having to follow the zoning laws, whatever it may be. So the public sector holds an immense amount of power if we're willing to use it. And so what I found is, when I wanted to do pre-K for all, you could say, well, they can stop you with all their power. Well, not if the people were with me. The people created such a dynamic that even, as I said, Republican-leaning state senators felt fearful to vote against pre-K for all, right? With the things we did, like paid sick days, that was between me and our city council. We had a progressive majority in our city council. They couldn't do anything about it. They could say the sky was going to fall if you give working people paid sick days. They couldn't stop us. So, I think there's almost an underestimation of the power that a progressive office holder can have once they get to office, if they are willing to use the muscle and go to the people. And this now gets to these candidates that we have. And I think what's really great, as I said, you've got capable public servants running, no scandals, no baggage. They've all worked in public service, and they all come from the grassroots in different ways. Now, with that kind of profile, you can inspire people to get on your side. So take an obvious example. Some in the status quo have attacked Zoran Mandani for wanting free buses. Buses.
Which should be just as an aside, the idea that this is some radical idea is so deranged and crazy. And it's like the sky is falling, the city will go bankrupt if we have fare free buses in a city that has a fare free ferry to Staten Island. Which he has pointed out, but the overwrought reaction to something as basic as this is like a tell, right? It's it really says something about how afraid of any change the status quo and the establishment really, how afraid they are.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, free public buses is something we're seeing in different parts of the United States, different parts of the world. Why? Because there's a lot of advantages. It's because if it gets more and more people into mass transit, it's good in terms of fighting pollution and climate problems. It's good in terms of reducing congestion. It addresses the income and inflation challenges people are dealing with. Obviously, there's no fare evasion question if you have free buses. It's a perfectly legitimate idea. You can argue it. You can argue the cost of it versus other things you might want to spend money on, but it's not illegitimate. An idea like that will take a leader who can capture the public imagination, build support, whether it's required in the city council, state legislature, whatever it is.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is part of the Lever's investigative newsroom and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf with help from Ariella Markowitz, and it was mixed by Arjun Singh. It had editing support from Joel Warner, Lucy Dean Stockton, and Jared Jakang Mayer. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.